Emma was walking across the yard, holding a bucket of feed for the chickens and ducks, when she suddenly heard a sharp cry. She froze, her gaze lifting. Above the field, a shadow flashed. Before she could process what it was, a hawk, moving with lightning speed, swooped down. "Chickens!" Emma shouted, her heart stopping in an instant. The hawk, like a bolt of lightning, seized one of the tiny chicks and ascended into the sky, its sharp talons firmly gripping the struggling creature. Emma darted forward, but it was already too late. In a heartbeat, the predator vanished beyond the horizon, leaving no trace. She stood there, frozen in shock, her eyes wide with confusion. How could it happen so fast? Her thoughts tangled. This was more than a mere accident. The hawk wasn't just part of nature, it was a threat, one that had come straight to their doorstep. Chapter 1. A quiet morning, ****. It was another calm and peaceful morning in the small house at the edge of town. The day had begun as it always did. The soft light of dawn spilling across the fields, the familiar chirps of the birds, and the comforting routine that defined the lives of John and Emma. They were a simple, elderly couple, their days marked by the steady rhythms of farm life, where every task and every creature had its place. The scent of fresh hay mingled with the earthy aroma of the garden as Emma went about her chores, and John, already up and working, was in the barn tending to the cows. Emma moved slowly, but there was a grace to her movements that came with years of practice. She opened the gate to the chicken coop, her old fingers curling around the rusted latch. The chickens, a small flock of brown and white, clucked around her feet, eager for their morning feed. She took a scoop of grain and scattered it across the dirt, watching as the birds pecked hungrily at the ground. The ducklings, still fluffy and yellow, waddled beside them, their tiny bodies darting this way and that as they joined the chickens in their feeding frenzy. The morning air was crisp, the smell of damp earth still lingering from the previous night's rain. It was a good start to the day. Emma was content. There was something about the simplicity of life on the farm that always made her feel grounded, as though time itself had slowed down here, and everything that mattered was right in front of her. Her thoughts were interrupted only by the occasional quack of a duck or the low moo of one of their cows, and for a moment, she could almost forget the world beyond their little homestead. She moved on to the next task, feeding the ducks, their orange beaks snapping at the food she tossed them, before heading towards the garden to check on the vegetables. Emma had always prided herself on her gardening skills, and this year the rows of tomatoes, peppers, and beans were looking particularly good. Her patch of corn, however, was where her attention lingered. The tall green stalks swayed gently in the morning breeze, but as she walked along the edge of the field, she noticed something strange. There, among the healthy, vibrant plants, a few stalks seemed wilted, their leaves yellowing and curling inward. She crouched down, inspecting them more closely. Something wasn't right. Emma ran her fingers over the leaves, their texture soft and dry to the touch. The soil, though still damp from the rain, seemed to have a strange, musty smell in certain spots. But she wasn't an expert on plant diseases. She'd never seen anything like this before, and though the wilted corn didn't seem to be spreading yet, Emma couldn't shake the unease in her chest. John would know what to do, she thought. Her husband always had a way of figuring things out. He was out in the barn now, no doubt mucking out the cow stalls, just as he had done every morning for as long as she could remember. The work was hard on his old bones, but John never complained. His hands, rough from years of labor, moved with purpose as he fed and cared for the animals. Emma knew he was probably thinking of the same things she was, the corn. They both knew the importance of that crop. If something was wrong with the corn, they would have to deal with it quickly before it spread to the rest of the field. Shaking her head, Emma decided it was best not to worry too much just yet. She would bring it up to John later. For now, she would finish her chores and take a deep breath, letting the calm of the morning wash over her again. John's deep voice called out from the barn, his voice carrying in the stillness of the morning. "Emma, I'm heading out to the field to check on the corn." She smiled to herself and turned to finish feeding the ducks. With a final glance at the corn, she tucked her worries away, at least for the time being. There was always time to deal with problems later. Right now, the day was still young, and there was work to be done. The sounds of the barn door creaking open and the steady clip-clop of John's boots on the dirt path signaled his approach. Emma heard him pause for a moment, likely taking in the sights of the yard, before he turned toward the cornfields, just as she had anticipated. Emma felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. It was nice, after all these years, to know the rhythm of each other's movements so well. She heard John's footsteps grow faint as he crossed the field toward the corn. The birds had finished eating, and the chickens began to scatter, some retreating to their nesting spots, while others scratched lazily in the dirt. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and turned to head back toward the house. But then, in the blink of an eye, something strange happened. The sound of the chickens clucking stopped suddenly, replaced by a sharp, unsettling silence. Emma's head snapped up, and her eyes darted toward the sky. A shadow, large and quick, flitted across the sun. Her heart skipped a beat. Before she could react, the shadow swooped lower, its sharp talons extending with deadly precision. A chilling cry echoed through the air as the predator snatched one of the chicks from the ground. "No!" Emma shouted, her voice filled with panic as she bolted forward, her old legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. But it was too late. The hawk, with incredible speed, pulled up into the sky, clutching the poor bird in its grasp, and flew off toward the distant hills. Emma stopped in her tracks, her breath ragged, her eyes locked on the sky where the bird had disappeared. A pit settled in her stomach as she stood frozen, her heart heavy. The chickens scattered, frightened by the sudden attack, but none of them came close to where the chick had been taken. By the time John reached the edge of the cornfield, Emma had collapsed to her knees, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. The peaceful morning, once so perfect, had shattered in an instant. A hawk had come out of nowhere and taken one of their birds. John rushed over to her, kneeling beside her and placing a hand on her shoulder. "What happened, Emma?" She couldn't speak at first, too overcome by the shock of the attack. She simply pointed to the sky, her finger trembling. "The hawk. It took one of the chicks." Her voice was barely a whisper, the weight of the loss sinking in. John followed her gaze, his eyes scanning the sky for any sign of the bird. He let out a long, frustrated sigh. "We've been having trouble with hawks around here lately," he said, more to himself than to her. "They're getting bolder." Emma's heart ached, but she nodded, trying to pull herself together. They had dealt with predators before. Foxes, raccoons, even wild dogs, but a hawk? That was something new, and far more dangerous. "We need to do something about this, John," she said, her voice steady now. "We can't keep losing our birds." He looked at her, his expression serious. "I'll start building a stronger pen for the chickens. Maybe some nets over the top, to keep them safe." Emma stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. "I'll help you," she said, her mind already working on plans for the future. The hawk may have won this round, but she wouldn't let it win again. As they headed back toward the barn to gather supplies for the new chicken enclosure, neither of them noticed the dark clouds beginning to gather on the horizon. Something else was coming. A problem they couldn't yet see, but would soon be forced to face. Chapter 2. The Predator's Return. The days that followed the hawk's attack felt strange. It wasn't that the world had changed, not in any real way. The sun still rose each morning, casting its golden light across the land, and the routine of farm life carried on as it always had. Yet there was a palpable tension in the air, a quiet sense of unease that seemed to hang over the homestead like a thick fog. The chickens, once carefree, were now jittery, their eyes constantly darting skyward, their clucks and squawks punctuated by moments of sudden silence. Every shadow in the sky seemed to carry the threat of another predator, another loss. Emma couldn't shake the image of the hawk's talons, sharp and deadly, its wings beating the air as it soared away with their precious chick. The helplessness of it lingered with her, making every day feel like a battle for control. The once peaceful mornings now felt full of lurking danger. That morning, John had risen earlier than usual. He knew that the only way to keep their animals safe was to build stronger defenses, and the chicken pen had to be reinforced. He'd already started gathering materials, a collection of old netting and wooden posts that had been left over from previous repairs, and he worked steadily, hammering in nails with determination. Emma, as always, was beside him, tending to the animals, gathering feed, and making sure the other birds were safe. But her mind was elsewhere, constantly alert for any sign of the hawk's return. Around midday, John stood back to admire his handiwork. The new pen was taller and sturdier than before, with heavy-duty netting stretched across the top. It wasn't a perfect solution. He knew the hawk was clever, and there would be no guarantees, but it was the best they could do for now. The chickens had already begun to take an interest in the new space, tentatively scratching the ground and pecking at the feed he'd placed inside. At least for the moment, they were safe. Emma looked on with a small sigh of relief, but the feeling didn't last long. "Do you think this will work?" she asked quietly, her eyes scanning the sky, waiting for the first sign of danger. "I hope so," John answered, "but we'll need to keep a close eye on them, especially in the mornings. If that hawk wants to come back, it will probably be early." Emma nodded. "I'll keep watch," she said, glancing toward the fields where the corn was growing tall. The corn that was still suffering from some mysterious ailment. The unease about the crop had not faded, but for the moment, the hawk was their most pressing concern. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken. Thick, heavy clouds rolled in from the horizon, and the wind picked up, swirling around the yard. It was the kind of storm that made the birds restless, their feathers ruffling as they huddled together for warmth. John had been working in the barn, checking on the cows, but as the first rumbles of thunder echoed in the distance, he decided to take a break. The air was thick with humidity, and the pressure of the impending storm seemed to be pushing down on everything. "Emma, let's head inside before the rain starts," he called out, wiping his brow as he walked toward the porch. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were still fixed on the sky, her face drawn with worry. She'd been watching the hawk's movements for days now, but something about the darkening clouds and the sudden chill in the air unsettled her. She had a strange feeling that they were not alone, that something was out there, watching them. It wasn't until the first crack of lightning split the sky that she finally moved, reluctantly stepping away from the field and heading toward the house. The wind picked up, and the rain soon followed, coming down in sheets, pounding against the roof of the barn and the sides of the house. The storm raged for hours, the thunder booming so loudly that it seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. By the time the storm had passed, the sky had darkened completely. The air was thick with the smell of rain and wet earth. The world outside had transformed. What had once been familiar was now an alien landscape, shrouded in mist and shadows. Emma and John sat in the kitchen, the warmth from the stove providing some comfort against the cold draft seeping through the cracks in the walls. They'd had their supper, a simple meal of bread and stew, but neither of them felt hungry. The storm had left them both feeling unsettled. "Do you think the hawk will come back tonight?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was trying to keep the fear out of her words, but it was hard to ignore the gnawing sense of dread in her chest. "I'm not sure," John replied, his brow furrowed. "But we can't just wait around for it to attack. We'll need to be ready." He stood up and moved to the window, peering out into the night. The wind had died down, but the moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, casting the yard in a shadowy gloom. "I'll check the chickens. Stay here and keep an eye out." Emma nodded, watching as he grabbed his coat and stepped out the door, disappearing into the night. She sat in the dim light, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened to the sounds of the storm dying down. Every rustle in the trees, every creak of the house, made her jump. Her thoughts drifted back to the cornfield, to the strange wilt that had spread across the crop in the last few days. What was happening to the corn? Was it just the weather, or was something more sinister at work? Suddenly, Emma's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp cry from outside. She stood up, her heart racing. The cry was unmistakable. It was the sound of a bird, a hawk's piercing scream cutting through the silence of the night. Emma rushed to the door, throwing it open, but the cold air hit her like a wall. She looked around frantically, trying to spot John, but there was no sign of him. The cry came again, closer this time, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Emma's pulse quickened. She was not imagining it. Something was out there, something dangerous, and she was certain it wasn't just the storm. She waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence that had settled in after the hawk's cry. And then, finally, she heard it. The faintest rustle in the brush, a shadow moving swiftly across the ground. It was the hawk. It had returned. "John!" She screamed into the night, her voice breaking through the stillness. But there was no answer. Her heart sank as she realized what she feared most. This was not just an attack on the chickens. This was something far more dangerous. And it had come at the worst possible time. Chapter 3. The storm breaks. The wind howled as it whipped through the trees, sending branches swaying and creaking like the groaning bones of the earth. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The darkness of the night had descended so completely that she could hardly make out anything beyond the faint outline of the barn in the distance. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the wet smell of the forest. But in the depths of that night, there was something else. A tension that hung in the air, something primal, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could hear the rustling in the underbrush again, a faint but unmistakable movement, like the sound of wings brushing against leaves. The hawk. Her heart raced at the thought, and a cold knot tightened in her stomach. She strained her ears, listening for any sound that would tell her where the bird was. But the cry that had pierced the air only moments ago was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. She called out again, her voice trembling with fear. "John! John! Where are you?" No answer. Only the wind, howling and restless, carrying away her words. Emma's pulse quickened, and in the deepest part of her chest, she felt an ominous certainty that something was terribly wrong. Her mind raced. What if the hawk had already struck again? What if John hadn't heard the cry in time? Emma turned on her heels and ran into the house, slamming the door behind her with force. She barely noticed the chill of the wooden floors beneath her bare feet as she hurried toward the window that overlooked the yard. Peering through the rain-streaked glass, her heart skipped a beat when she saw the shadow of a figure moving in the dim light. "John!" she gasped, relief flooding through her veins. She could make out the silhouette of her husband, moving slowly, cautiously, toward the chicken pen. The wind was strong enough now that it felt like it could blow the house off its foundation. But John was moving with purpose, his hand resting on the handle of a lantern. Emma grabbed her shawl and threw it over her shoulders, stepping back outside into the storm, the wind biting at her skin as she called his name. "John, wait for me!" She didn't wait for him to acknowledge her. She moved quickly, the soft patter of rain against the earth drowned out by the roar of the wind and her own racing thoughts. What if the hawk had already been here? What if... Her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of flapping wings, the whoosh of air that told her the hawk was near. Emma's heart stopped in her chest as she whipped her head around, scanning the sky. There, in the dim light of the lantern, she saw the faintest blur, something large and fast. The hawk. It was circling above them, its wings outstretched, cutting through the storm with precision. Emma gasped, but before she could call out, the bird suddenly dived, dropping like a stone. Its claws extended toward the pen where the chickens huddled beneath the makeshift shelter. John didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, raising the lantern above his head, his voice commanding and steady as he shouted, "Go away! Get away from our chickens!" The hawk, startled by the sudden movement, veered sharply to the side, disappearing into the mist. But it wasn't done. Emma could hear the telltale screech of the bird as it wheeled around, higher this time, just above their heads. John moved quickly, pushing Emma behind him. "Stay back, Emma. Get inside." But Emma didn't listen. She refused to retreat into the safety of the house while her husband faced off with the bird. They had built this life together, and they would defend it together. Without thinking, she grabbed the heavy garden rake that leaned against the porch and ran toward the pen. "John, we can't let it take any more." she cried, her voice rising above the sound of the wind. John turned, his face pale in the lantern's glow, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's too dangerous. We need to get inside now before it comes back for another strike." The hawk was circling again, and this time it was closer. Emma could feel the air grow colder as the bird descended toward them, its wings cutting through the storm like a dark omen. The suddenness of its movements left no time for hesitation. It dove again, aiming straight for the pen. This time, Emma's heart surged with adrenaline. Without thinking, she hurled herself toward the pen, the rake held tightly in her hands. She screamed, trying to startle the hawk, anything to keep it from taking another bird. But in that moment of desperation, something unexpected happened. The hawk paused midair. It hovered for a second, its sharp, calculating eyes locking onto her. The bird was silent now, its wings still as if the storm had suddenly ceased. For a brief, terrible moment, Emma thought it would dive directly for her. Then, in the blink of an eye, the hawk folded its wings and flew off into the dark night, disappearing like a shadow, leaving behind only the rush of wind and the distant echo of thunder. Emma stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she lowered the rake, her eyes searching the sky for any sign of the bird's return. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but now it felt like a veil over her skin, cooling the heat of fear that still clung to her. "Is it gone?" Emma whispered, turning to John. John, who had been standing motionless just a few feet away, gave a slow nod. His face was grim, but there was a trace of relief in his eyes. "For now," he said quietly, "but it'll be back. It always comes back." They both turned toward the pen, where the chickens were now huddled together, their feathers fluffed up in terror. Emma could see the fear in their eyes, the trembling of their small bodies. "We need to reinforce the pen, Emma," John said, his voice low and serious. "And we'll have to keep a watch on the chickens day and night. It's not just a hawk anymore. It's become a problem we can't ignore." Emma nodded. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The hawk wasn't just a predator. It had become a symbol of something larger, something out of their control. But this was their home, their animals, and they weren't going to let anything take them without a fight. As they turned to head back to the house, Emma couldn't help but glance one last time at the empty sky. The storm was beginning to clear, but in its wake, something remained. A feeling of fragility, like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. And there was still the matter of the corn, the withering stalks that seemed to be growing worse by the day. Emma's unease about the crops had grown with the hawk's presence. There was a storm on the horizon, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the weather they needed to worry about. The real danger was much closer than they could have ever imagined. As they stepped inside the house, the sound of the storm fading into the distance, Emma and John both felt the weight of the challenges ahead. It wasn't just about protecting the animals anymore. It was about protecting everything they had worked so hard to build. And as they looked toward the future, neither of them could shake the growing feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than they had ever anticipated. Chapter 4. Bitter Harvest. The morning after the storm, the world was still. The air was thick with moisture, and the sun had only just begun to poke through the heavy clouds, casting a pale light across the wet earth. Emma stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the fields that stretched beyond the barn. Her mind was clouded with the events of the previous night, the hawk's return, the fear that had gripped her, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. But there was something else tugging at her thoughts as well. The cornfield. She had hardly slept, her mind fixated on the wilting stalks that had seemed to multiply overnight. The rows of corn, once vibrant and full of promise, now sagged beneath the weight of some unseen force. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the problem was deeper than just the weather, that something was eating away at their crops from the inside. Her gaze shifted from the fields to the barn where John was already at work, moving among the cows and making his rounds. He had always been the first to rise, the first to begin the day, and today was no different. But Emma could see that his movements were slower than usual, as though the weight of their problems was taking its toll. She grabbed her shawl and went outside, feeling the coolness of the air as it clung to her skin. Her feet crunched softly against the wet ground as she made her way to the barn. "John," she called softly as she stepped inside, her voice echoing against the wooden walls. He looked up from his work, a small frown creasing his forehead. "Morning, love," he said, his tone tired but warm. "I was just making sure the cows had enough feed. They don't seem too bothered by the storm." Emma nodded but didn't smile. "John, we need to talk about the corn." He paused, the weight of her words settling in. "I know, it's getting worse." She met his gaze, her brow furrowed with worry. "It's not just the weather, is it? Something's wrong. The soil. It feels off, almost like something's draining the life out of it." John sighed heavily, his hand running through his graying hair. "I've been thinking the same thing. I checked the soil and it's dry as a bone. I can't explain it, Em. We've had enough rain, but something's not right. It's like the earth's lost its strength." "Do you think it's a disease?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. The thought of their crop failing, after all their hard work, made her stomach turn. John shook his head. "I don't know. Could be. We're not the only ones having trouble with corn this season. I've heard whispers from other farmers. Crops are failing all over, but no one knows why. Some say it's the weather, others say it's pests. But no one's figured it out for sure." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. Their livelihood was tied to that crop. Without the corn, there would be nothing to feed the animals through the winter. There would be no harvest to store, no extra to sell. It would mean the difference between scraping by and losing everything. "I don't know what we're going to do if it gets worse," she said softly, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. "We've already lost one crop to the drought, and now this. How much more can we take?" John stepped toward her and took her hands in his. His touch was warm, grounding her in the present, in this moment. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But Emma could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the crack in his calm facade. She had known him long enough to read between the lines, and right now, the lines were heavy with doubt. They spent the rest of the morning checking the rest of the fields, but what they found only deepened their concern. The corn was not just withering, it was rotting from the inside out. The leaves were brittle, curling at the edges, and the stalks looked like they had been scorched by some unseen flame. It was as if the earth itself had turned against them, refusing to nourish the crop. Emma crouched down and touched the soil, feeling its texture beneath her fingers. It was dry, yes, but there was something else. It felt unnatural, almost toxic, as if something had tainted it. "Do you think it's the same thing that happened to the other fields?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper as she looked up at John. John didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran his hand over his face, his eyes dark with worry. "I don't know, Em, but we need to act fast. If this keeps up, we could lose the whole harvest." He looked out over the field, his gaze distant, as if trying to calculate the odds of their survival. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of the earth with it, but Emma could barely smell it. Her senses were clouded by fear and uncertainty. "We'll have to see if we can get someone to look at the soil," John said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Maybe there's something we can do to save it. I don't know, but we can't just stand here and watch it die." Emma nodded, though the words didn't bring her any comfort. She had known for a while that something was wrong with their land, but seeing it with her own eyes, seeing their hopes for the future wither before her, was something entirely different. As they left the field and headed back toward the barn, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were only beginning. The hawk had been a warning, a sign of something larger at play. And now, with the corn on the verge of failing, it felt like the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, as they sat at the dinner table, the weight of the day hung heavy between them. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, but the warmth it provided seemed distant, unable to cut through the chill of worry that had settled over the house. John broke the silence first, his voice low. "I've been thinking, Em, maybe we should talk to some of the neighbors. See if they've noticed anything strange happening with their crops. Maybe it's something in the air, something we can't control. Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure if it would help. They had always managed on their own, relying on their own knowledge and experience. But this was different. This felt like something far beyond their control. "I'll speak to some of them tomorrow," she said quietly, though the thought of facing another day filled with uncertainty and fear left her exhausted. "But John, what if we can't fix it? What if we lose everything?" John met her gaze, his eyes steady but filled with the same unspoken fear she was feeling. "We'll figure it out, Em. We always do." But as Emma looked at him, she couldn't help but wonder if this time it might be different. And that thought, more than anything, filled her with dread. The storm was still far from over, and they were no closer to finding the answers they needed. The hawk might have been a warning, but the true danger was much closer than they realized. And in the coming days, it would become clear that the challenges they faced were only the beginning of a much larger struggle. As the last light of the day faded from the sky, Emma closed her eyes and prayed for strength. But in the quiet of the night, she could already hear the distant sound of wings. Chapter 5. The Shadow Over the Field. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty and restless energy. The weight of the failing crops pressed heavily on Emma and John. Each morning, they inspected the cornfield again, each time hoping for a sign of improvement, but the stalks were only growing worse. John had taken to moving from one field to another, examining the soil, the leaves, the sickly yellow hue of the cornstalks, as though he could find some hidden clue that would explain the devastation. But every time, the same hopeless sight greeted him. The other farmers in town had been equally puzzled by the blight, though none had ventured as far as Emma and John's land to inspect it closely. There were rumors of drought affecting the soil, whispers of pests or blights creeping through the county. But none of those theories seemed to explain what was happening here. What had once been a bountiful field now looked as though it had been ravaged by some unseen hand. It wasn't the soil, John was sure of that. There was something more to it, something that didn't make sense. It was late one afternoon when they received an unexpected visitor. John was out in the barn, gathering tools to fix the gate on the chicken coop, when he heard the soft sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path. He looked up, squinting against the low light of the setting sun. It was Ethan, a farmer who lived a few miles down the road. His face was grim, his eyes tired as he approached with the familiar heavy step of someone who had been working the land from sunup to sundown. "Evening, John," Ethan said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "I heard about your corn." John nodded, his heart sinking slightly at the mention of the crop. "It's not good, Ethan. It's spreading faster than we can handle it." Ethan shifted his weight, clearly uneasy. "I've seen it on my own land. Not as bad as yours, but it's creeping in. Whatever it is, it's spreading like wildfire. Thought maybe you'd want to talk to someone who might know a bit more about it." John's interest peaked, though a wary sense of dread began to settle deep in his chest. "What do you mean?" Ethan glanced around, making sure no one else was nearby, then lowered his voice. "You've heard the stories, right? About the cursed land?" John froze for a moment, taken aback by the words. He had heard rumors, of course, but he had always dismissed them as superstitions. The land was old, yes, but cursed? He couldn't bring himself to believe it. "Cursed land?" John echoed with a faint laugh. "You're talking about old folk tales, Ethan. We've got a drought and maybe some pests. It's just nature doing what it does." Ethan's face darkened, and he glanced over his shoulder again, as if expecting someone to be watching. "I don't know, John. Some people around here swear by it. My uncle, he lived on the old Miller farm over by the creek. He used to say that there were places on this land, parts of it, that just didn't want to give." John frowned, unsure whether to dismiss this as more small-town superstition or take it seriously. But there was something in Ethan's eyes that made him hesitate. "I've got an old man who comes around once in a while," Ethan continued. "Calls himself a healer. Comes from the next county over. Says he knows about these things. If you want, I can send him your way." John hesitated, his thoughts running in 1,000 directions. He wasn't the type to believe in curses or things that couldn't be explained by hard work and reason. But the cornfield, how it had deteriorated so quickly, felt different. And then there was the hawk, the way it had circled their land, as if it had been watching them, waiting for something. He looked at Ethan, searching his face for any sign of jest. But there was none. Ethan was serious. "All right," John said finally, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. "Send him over. But if it's some kind of nonsense..." Ethan held up a hand, cutting him off. "No nonsense, I promise you. Just see for yourself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the quiet of the evening settled over the house. Emma was in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of stew and bread. When John returned inside, his face marked with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Who was that?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder as she chopped vegetables. "It was Ethan," John said, sitting down at the table. "He heard about the corn, and he thinks we might need some help." "Help?" Emma asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "What kind of help?" John hesitated for a moment, trying to gauge how Emma would react. He mentioned an old healer, someone who might be able to help us understand what's happening with the land. Emma raised an eyebrow, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity in her eyes. "A healer? I know," John said with a sigh. "It sounds ridiculous, but Ethan's not the kind to make things up. He insists that this man knows something about, well, things like this." Emma set the knife down, taking a moment to think. Her eyes were drawn to the firelight flickering in the hearth, the shadows dancing on the walls. The cornfields outside felt distant and untouchable, like a problem they couldn't solve. But something inside her told her that they had no other choice but to try. "I suppose we could meet him," Emma said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "Maybe he'll have answers we can't find on our own." John nodded, grateful for her calmness. "I'll send word to Ethan. He'll bring him over tomorrow." That night, as they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the wind were the only noises that filled the space. Emma's mind wandered, her thoughts heavy with the idea of the healer. She didn't know what to expect from a man who claimed to understand things beyond the realm of ordinary life. But she had seen the land change too quickly, too drastically, to simply ignore the possibility that something else was at work. The following morning brought an unexpected chill in the air, despite the promise of spring. John was up early, preparing for the arrival of the healer, while Emma tended to the animals, her mind swirling with the weight of what was to come. The day felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. By mid-morning, a knock came at the door. Emma opened it to find Ethan standing with an older man at his side. The man was thin, his skin weathered by years of labor, his eyes sharp and dark, as though he could see through the very soil beneath his feet. "This is Ezra," Ethan said quietly, his voice tinged with a hint of reverence. "He's the one I told you about." Ezra looked Emma over with a steady gaze, his expression unreadable. "I've heard about the corn. Let me take a look." Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside, and Emma felt a strange chill crawl up her spine. There was something about him that felt different, as if he had lived through centuries instead of just years. "Show me the field," Ezra said, his voice low, almost whispering, as though he was speaking to the land itself. John and Emma exchanged a glance before leading him out to the cornfield, unsure of what to expect. But deep down, they both felt the same. They had run out of options. As they walked toward the field, Ezra spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the land will take back what it has given. Not all that grows in the earth is meant to stay." Emma's heart sank, but she said nothing, unsure if she wanted to hear more. They reached the cornfield, and Ezra knelt down to examine the soil. His fingers moved over the earth with careful precision, his eyes scanning the area around him. Then he stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his pants. "The land has been sickened," he said, his voice grave. "And it is not just the drought or the pests. There is something much deeper at work." Emma's stomach twisted with fear. "What does that mean? Can we save it?" Ezra's eyes met hers, his expression unreadable. "It's not just the crops that need saving, girl. It's the land itself. And the price may be higher than you're willing to pay." John's voice was steady, but the tension in it was undeniable. "What are you saying? Can you help us?" Ezra hesitated, as though weighing the consequences of his next words. "I can help, but know this. Sometimes to heal, one must first break. The land needs to be reborn, and that will not come without sacrifice." Emma and John stood silent, the weight of his words sinking in like stones in their hearts. The road ahead would not be easy, and whatever lay ahead, it would demand more from them than they had ever imagined. As the wind picked up around them, Emma could hear the faintest sound, a flap of wings, distant but growing closer. The hawk was watching them again. Chapter 6. The Price of Rebirth. The morning after Ezra's arrival was filled with an eerie stillness. The air felt heavier, the sky a pale gray canvas that seemed to press down on the earth below. Emma couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep inside her, a feeling that had only grown stronger after hearing Ezra's cryptic words the night before. The land needs to be reborn, and that will not come without sacrifice. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the damp morning fog lift over the fields. John had already gone to the barn, his movements slow and deliberate as he checked on the animals. It was as though the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders, a burden that neither of them had been prepared to carry. Emma felt her heart ache for him. He was a man of action, of strength and resolve. But lately, she had seen cracks in his composure, moments when doubt had crept into his voice. She couldn't help but wonder if they were running out of time. The knock at the door came as she was stirring the pot of soup. Her hands trembled as she wiped them on her apron, trying to steady herself before opening the door. She knew who it was before she even reached the threshold. Ezra stood there, his figure shrouded in the soft light of the morning, a silhouette of quiet power. His eyes were dark, piercing, and as he stepped inside, Emma felt a coldness settle around her. "I've seen what's happening with the land," Ezra said, his voice low, his gaze scanning the kitchen with a quiet intensity. "And I've come to offer a solution. But it won't be easy." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? Can you save it?" Her voice was tight with hope, but also with fear. If the answer was more bad news, she wasn't sure how much more she could take. Ezra nodded slowly. "I can help, but like I said before, this will require a price. Not just for you and John, but for the land itself." Emma's mind raced. What kind of price? He met her eyes, his expression unreadable. "The land demands a balance, a restoration of the natural order. The sickness you're seeing in your crops is not just the result of weather or pests. There is something deeper, something unnatural that has upset the balance. And it is this imbalance that must be corrected." John entered the room then, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Ezra standing in the middle of their home, his sharp eyes taking in the healer's presence with quiet wariness. "What's going on?" John asked, his voice low but steady. Ezra turned toward him, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke. "The land is sick. I can help you heal it, but it will take more than just planting and praying. There is a cost to everything." John stepped closer, his brow furrowed with both confusion and concern. "We've been trying to save the land, but nothing works." "What do you mean by cost? Are you talking about money?" Ezra shook his head. "No, the price is something different. It is the balance between the land and those who tend it. The crops are not the only thing suffering here. The animals, the soil, the air, everything is out of sync. This imbalance must be addressed." Emma's stomach tightened as the weight of his words sank in. "What do we have to do?" Ezra looked from Emma to John, his eyes sharp with an unsettling knowing. "The land requires an offering, something that was once of it, something that can restore what has been lost. I will guide you through the process, but you must be prepared. The land will ask for something in return. Are you willing to give it?" John's voice was steady but uncertain. "What kind of offering?" Ezra's gaze grew colder. "The land's demands are not always clear, but they are always necessary. Sometimes the land asks for a sacrifice of flesh, of blood, in order to restore the balance. It is not a decision I take lightly, but it is the only way to heal the damage." Emma felt a chill run down her spine as Ezra's words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. She glanced at John, whose face was pale but resolute. He was a man who had spent his life working the land, who had always believed in the simple, straightforward ways of nature. But now, with the prospect of a sacrifice hanging over them, she could see that even he was unsure of what to do. "We've already lost so much," John said softly. "The corn is dying, the animals are at risk. I'll do whatever it takes to save what we have left." Ezra nodded. "Very well. Tomorrow we will begin." The following day, as the sun rose behind the hills, the world felt quieter than usual. It was as if the land itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the moment of reckoning. Emma and John worked alongside Ezra in silence, preparing for the ritual that would, they hoped, restore the balance. Ezra had explained that the offering would take place in the heart of the cornfield, at the very center of where the damage had first started. There, they would place a symbol of life, something that represented the land's vitality, something to give back to the earth in exchange for its healing. As they walked toward the field, Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The ritual was unfamiliar to her, filled with symbols and words she didn't understand. But she trusted Ezra, as strange as it all seemed. The land needed something to restore it, and they were willing to give whatever they could. When they reached the center of the cornfield, Ezra gestured for them to stop. "This is where the imbalance began," he said quietly. "Here we will make our offering." John knelt beside the earth, digging a small hole in the dry, cracked soil. Emma watched as he worked, his hands moving with precision, as if he had done this all his life. Then Ezra took a small, ornate knife from his belt, its handle carved with strange symbols, and handed it to John. "Take this," Ezra said. "Use it to cut what needs to be cut." John hesitated, looking down at the blade, then back at Emma. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But then he nodded, as if accepting the responsibility that had been placed on him. John's hands were steady as he took the knife, and without another word, he made a deep cut into the soil, drawing a line of blood from the earth itself. As soon as the blood hit the soil, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of something sweet and earthy, like a spring rain after a long drought. The air around them seemed to hum with an almost palpable energy. Ezra nodded approvingly. "The offering has been made. Now we wait." They spent the rest of the day tending to the land, checking on the animals and offering up quiet prayers. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows across the barnyard. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the land was reacting to what they had done. And yet, there was still a part of her that feared the unknown price they might have to pay. The sacrifice had been made, but would it be enough? As the night stretched on, Emma sat quietly with John, both of them staring into the fire. Their hands, though calloused and worn from years of work, seemed to find comfort in each other's touch. The wind had picked up again, and the shadows seemed to dance around them, but in the distance, the sky was growing brighter. Dawn was just around the corner. Tomorrow they would know if the land had accepted their offering. And tomorrow, they would discover if the price they had paid was enough to restore what had been lost. As the night deepened, Emma couldn't help but feel the presence of something greater than herself, watching over them. It wasn't just the land, nor the corn, nor the animals. It was something older, something deeper, and she knew whatever happened next, the land would never be the same again. The wind howled through the trees as the first stars began to appear in the sky. Chapter 7. The Turning of the Tide. The night passed slowly, the quiet sounds of the farm blending with the deep, soothing hum of the wind. Emma lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet the swirling thoughts in her mind. The events of the past days, Ezra's cryptic words, the strange ritual in the cornfield, the blood spilled on the earth, had set her nerves on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous was unfolding, something that would forever change their lives. The weight of the decision lingered in her chest, like an anchor pulling her deeper into uncertainty. As dawn broke, soft and pale, Emma rose from the bed with a heavy sigh. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside into the cool, mist-laden morning. The ground beneath her feet was still damp from the night air, and she could feel the freshness of the day ahead, the earth itself almost holding its breath as the sun slowly began to rise over the horizon. John was already outside, working with the animals. His face was drawn with fatigue, the lines of worry that had deepened in the last few weeks making him appear older than his years. Emma watched him for a moment, before walking over to the barn, where the faint sound of cowbells echoed through the morning silence. She found him in the corner of the barn, brushing down one of the cows, his motions slow and methodical. Emma stood silently in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene, the familiar, calming rhythm of the morning chores that had been their life for so many years. And yet, something had shifted. The land felt different, and so did John. She could sense it in the air. Everything was on the verge of change, teetering on the edge of something new. John stopped brushing the cow and glanced up when he heard her footsteps. His eyes softened as he met her gaze, though the unease still lingered in them. "How are you feeling?" Emma asked quietly, walking over to him. John gave a small shake of his head. "I don't know," he muttered. I've been out here thinking about the field. I know we did what we could, but I'm not sure it'll work. I've never done anything like that before." "I know," Emma said softly, resting a hand on his arm. "Neither have I." They stood there for a moment, just the two of them in the quiet morning, the soft sounds of the barn and the cows settling in around them. Then, John straightened, his shoulders tense. He motioned toward the field. "We'll go check the corn today," he said, his voice steady but heavy with uncertainty. "We'll know soon enough if it worked." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, the sacrifice they had made would be enough. The land, the corn, it had to heal. It just had to. After a quick breakfast, the two of them set out toward the cornfield. The wind had picked up again, rustling the tall grass at the edges of the fields, but the air felt different, fresher somehow, as if it had been purified by the night. As they neared the field, Emma's breath caught in her throat. The land looked different. Where the corn had once been withered and yellowed, now there was a faint sign of green returning to the stalks. Not much, just a glimmer of life peeking through the fading yellow leaves. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a rush of relief through Emma's chest. John stopped a few paces ahead of her, staring at the field in stunned silence. "Look at that," he whispered. It's changing." The two of them walked into the field, their steps light with cautious optimism. Emma reached out to touch one of the corn stalks, the leaves still brittle beneath her fingers, but the faintest hint of new growth had begun to push through the soil. It was as though the earth was stretching itself awake, shaking off the sickness that had plagued it for weeks. "We did it," Emma breathed, her voice almost disbelieving. John's face was tight with emotion, a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's not much yet, but it's something." As they walked further into the field, they could see more and more signs of life. The corn, though still weak and fragile, was coming back to life. The crops, once dry and desperate, were beginning to turn green once again, their roots reaching deeper into the earth. It was slow, but it was happening. And in that moment, Emma allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the land was healing. But as the morning wore on, their brief moment of triumph was interrupted by something unexpected. The sharp, high-pitched cry of a bird broke through the air, a call that was unmistakable. Emma's heart stopped, and she turned toward the sky just in time to see the dark shape of a bird of prey diving toward the field. "No!" she cried out, her voice rising in panic. "Not again!" John's eyes widened as the hawk, its wings spread wide, swooped down over the field with incredible speed. It moved in a blur of motion, its sharp talons outstretched. Emma's stomach dropped as she saw it target one of the newly revived corn stalks. Then, with terrifying precision, it reached out and plucked something from the ground. A cry of horror escaped Emma's lips as she realized what had happened. The hawk had taken one of their newly planted crops. This time, it wasn't just an animal. It was a sign of hope, a symbol of the land's rebirth. And it was gone in an instant. Before they could react, the hawk was already disappearing into the sky, its prey clutched tightly in its talons. Emma watched helplessly as it flew further and further away, a shadow against the brightening sky. "What was that?" John muttered, his voice shaking with disbelief. Emma stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the hawk had been. She felt the crushing weight of defeat settling in once again. The land had begun to heal, yes, but the hawk. The hawk was a sign that something else, something darker, was still at play. "This isn't over," Emma whispered, her voice low and heavy with the weight of unspoken fear. "It's not over yet." They stood together in the field for a long while, watching the sky, the land, and the distant silhouette of the hawk as it faded into the horizon. And though the corn was slowly coming back to life, Emma knew that this battle was far from won. The price they had paid for the land's healing was only the beginning. Chapter 8. The Storm Before the Calm. The following days blurred into one another, each morning carrying a quiet sense of urgency. Emma and John's routines remained largely unchanged, but beneath the surface of their daily lives, a new tension simmered. The land, though slowly recovering, seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something. And the hawk's attack on the cornfield haunted Emma's thoughts, a constant reminder that their struggle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. John, ever the pragmatist, threw himself into the work with his usual determination. He tended to the animals with care, making sure their coats were brushed and their pens cleaned. He checked the fences that kept the pigs and goats corralled, ensuring nothing had broken loose in the night. Emma, for her part, spent long hours in the kitchen preparing food and checking on the small garden they had by the house. The cornfield was still their main concern, though, and every day they walked out there to see how the crops were progressing. Each time they visited the field, Emma felt a renewed sense of hope. The corn had continued to grow, albeit slowly. The dark, barren earth was slowly being replaced by the soft green of new life. The offering to the land had made a difference, but it was clear the balance was still fragile. The weather, too, seemed uncertain, as though the earth itself was in turmoil. One morning, as Emma and John made their way toward the field, the sky above them darkened. Clouds, heavy and gray, had rolled in faster than they had anticipated. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The wind had shifted, and the scent of rain hung thick in the air. "Looks like we're in for a downpour," John muttered, adjusting the brim of his hat against the growing wind. "Let's make sure the animals are settled before it hits." Emma nodded, though she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was as though someone was watching them. The sensation was almost tangible, like an unseen presence that hovered just beyond the reach of their senses. She shook off the thought as they made their way to the barn, where the animals had already begun to stir restlessly. John was right. The storm was coming, and it was going to be a big one. The wind had picked up significantly by the time they finished tending to the animals, and the first few drops of rain had begun to fall. Emma and John hurried into the house, where the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, offering a sense of comfort against the growing storm outside. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the roar of the wind as it picked up strength, the rain now coming down in sheets. The storm was fierce, but it wasn't unusual for this time of year. Emma tried to shake off the unease that had been creeping up on her over the past few days. It wasn't just the hawk anymore. Something felt wrong. The land, the animals, everything seemed to be shifting, like a great wave was building beneath the surface. Just as the storm reached its peak, a loud knock at the door broke the quiet of the house. Emma's heart skipped in her chest. She wasn't expecting anyone, least of all in such weather. She glanced at John, who raised an eyebrow in silent question. He stood up to answer the door before Emma could say anything. When John opened the door, he was greeted by a figure standing at the threshold, soaked through with rain. Ezra. Emma felt her stomach twist as the healer stepped inside, shaking the rain from his cloak. His eyes were somber, his expression unreadable. "I thought I should come," Ezra said quietly, his voice barely rising above the sound of the storm outside. The land, it is still in danger. And something else is coming. John closed the door behind him, his gaze fixed on Ezra. What do you mean? The corn is coming back. It's not perfect, but it's growing. Ezra stepped further into the warmth of the house, his boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. It's not just about the corn. It's not just about what you can see. There is something deeper at work here, a force of nature that is beyond your understanding. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she looked between the two men. What do you mean, Ezra? What's happening? Ezra's eyes darkened as he met her gaze. The hawk was a sign, he said slowly. But it was only the beginning. The land's imbalance goes deeper than you know. There is a force stirring in the earth, something older than anything you can comprehend. And it is not just the corn that suffers. All of it, the animals, the soil, the water, it's all connected. And if you don't restore the balance soon, the land itself will turn against you. Emma felt a chill run through her. She looked at John, whose face had grown pale, but his expression was one of determination. He had always believed in the land, trusted it to provide, to heal. But now it was clear that there were things they didn't understand, forces beyond their control. Is there anything we can do? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra's gaze softened, though his words remained heavy. You've already done much, more than most would ever consider. But the storm is coming. Not just the one outside. There's something else coming, something worse. And it will not be stopped by your offerings alone. The words hung in the air, thick and foreboding. John clenched his fists, his jaw tight. What do we need to do, Ezra? Tell us. We'll do whatever it takes. Ezra nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and resolve. You must gather everything that is yours, your animals, your crops, everything that is still living. You must move them away from the land. The storm that is coming will sweep through here, and it will not leave anything untouched. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Move everything? Where? How? There is a safe place, Ezra said, his voice almost a whisper now. The forest. The old grove just beyond the hills. It is protected, even now, from the forces that are stirring in the land. Take your animals, take your crops, and move them there. It is the only way to survive the storm that is coming. John looked at Emma, his eyes grim but resolute. We'll do it. We don't have much time. Ezra's face softened with a rare glimpse of sympathy. You must hurry. The storm will come quickly. You have only until the full moon rises. With that, Ezra turned and walked toward the door, his cloak swirling behind him like a shadow. Good luck, he said quietly. And remember, the land will always have its demands. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Emma and John standing in the quiet aftermath of his visit. The storm outside raged with new intensity, the wind howling like a wild animal, as if the land itself were mourning the loss of something precious. Do you believe him? Emma asked, her voice shaking. John looked out the window at the darkened horizon, his face hard and set with determination. I don't know what to believe anymore, but we don't have a choice. We have to save what we can. And with that, the preparations began. The storm was coming, and they had only hours to act. As the night drew closer, the weight of the unknown pressed down on them. But they both knew that whatever was ahead, they would face it together. The land, the storm, the hawk, it was all connected now, and they would fight to the very end to protect what they had built. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the storm, the one that Ezra had spoken of, was only the beginning. Something darker, something deeper was coming, and it would change everything. Chapter 9. The Heart of the Storm. The storm outside grew more furious with each passing hour. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches to their breaking point, and the rain fell in torrential sheets, like nature itself was mourning. Inside, Emma and John worked with the frantic urgency of people who knew that every moment counted. Time was slipping away, and the clock was ticking down to the dreaded full moon. The weight of Ezra's words haunted them, but they had no choice. The land, the animals, and their very survival now depended on what they could do before nightfall. John had already begun moving the animals into the barn, the chaos of the storm compounding the difficulty of their task. The pigs squealed in confusion, the cows lowed uneasily, and the chickens squawked in a panic. Emma could hear them all, their distress mingling with the sound of the storm outside, a cacophony of fear and confusion. She took a deep breath and set to work herself, gathering the last of the supplies they would need for their journey to the grove. The old grove. Emma had only heard of it in hushed whispers, a place from the past that no one dared visit unless absolutely necessary. It was a sanctuary, a haven protected by forces older than anyone could understand. And now it was their only hope. John moved with surprising speed and efficiency, despite his age. His hands were steady as he tightened the ropes around the animals, ensuring they would be able to travel. Emma watched him for a moment, her heart aching at the thought of the life they had known, of the land they had cared for so lovingly, being left behind in such turmoil. "We'll make it," John muttered under his breath, as if speaking to himself as much as to Emma. His eyes, though, were dark with worry. Emma nodded, though her throat felt tight. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in their strength and resolve. But something deep within her, something primal, told her that they were not just fighting against a storm. There was something far more dangerous lurking in the shadows, something that had yet to reveal itself. "John," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you feel it? Something's not right." John paused, looking up from his work. His brow furrowed in concern, but he didn't speak at first. He turned toward the open barn doors, where the storm raged outside, and then, with a sharp intake of breath, he looked back at Emma. "I feel it too," he said softly, "but we can't waste any more time. We need to get everything to the grove before it's too late." Emma swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. She turned to finish her task, though every movement felt like it was happening in slow motion, like time itself was slipping through her fingers. Her mind was racing, thoughts jumbled together in a blur of concern. But deep down, she knew one thing with certainty. The storm wasn't just a natural disaster. There was something else at work here, something dark and ancient. As they moved the last of the animals into the barn, the rain outside intensified. Thunder rumbled in the distance, its low growl making the ground tremble. The storm had taken on a life of its own now, and the wind, once a mere inconvenience, had become a force of nature, snapping at everything in its path. But the worst was yet to come. They had nearly finished securing the animals when the first sign of the supernatural appeared. Emma was standing by the barn door when she saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the distance, something moving against the backdrop of the storm. She squinted into the rain, trying to make sense of it. It was then that she saw the figure, tall, dark, and unmistakably human in form, though it seemed to shimmer, as if it wasn't entirely part of the world they knew. She gasped and grabbed John's arm. "John, look." He followed her gaze, his expression darkening. The figure moved closer, walking against the wind as though it were nothing. It was still far enough away that they couldn't make out any details, but Emma could feel the weight of its presence, something ancient and unsettling that sent a chill running down her spine. "What is that?" John muttered, his voice low and strained. "I don't know," Emma replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "But I don't think it's friendly." As the figure approached, it began to take shape, its form becoming clearer despite the storm. Tall man, no, not a man. Something else. His skin was pale, almost white, and his eyes gleamed with an unnatural intensity that pierced the darkness. His clothes were torn and worn, as if they had been exposed to the elements for far longer than they should have been. His gaze locked onto Emma and John with unnerving precision, and a deep, unsettling feeling washed over Emma. The figure stopped just beyond the barn's threshold, its eyes never leaving them. For a moment, there was only silence. The storm outside seemed to fade, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, with a voice like gravel scraping over stone, the figure spoke. "You cannot run from what is coming," it said, its voice cold and hollow. "The land belongs to the earth, and the earth will have its due." Emma's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. John's face had gone pale, and his hand instinctively reached for the door, preparing to close it. But the figure raised one hand, and with a single gesture, the barn door slammed shut, trapping them inside. "You think you can escape?" the figure hissed, its voice now like the wind itself, rattling the walls of the barn. "You cannot escape what is already upon you." The air inside the barn seemed to warp, growing thick with the weight of the figure's words. Emma could feel the very ground beneath her feet quiver, as if it were alive and aware of the danger. Her heart raced as she glanced at John, his eyes wide with disbelief. But even in the midst of his fear, there was a flicker of defiance in his gaze. "You won't stop us," he said, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. "We will protect our home." The figure laughed, a hollow sound that reverberated through the barn like the echo of a dying wind. "This land does not belong to you," it said, stepping forward. "It belongs to something older, something that cannot be controlled. And when the storm comes, when the earth reclaims what is hers, you will have no choice but to surrender." Before Emma could respond, a sudden crash of thunder split the sky, followed by an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow the world whole. The figure's silhouette began to fade, dissolving into the storm as though it were made of mist. And just like that, it was gone. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling louder than ever. But in the quiet aftermath, as Emma and John stood there in stunned silence, one thing was clear. They were no longer fighting just a storm. Something far darker had awoken, and it was coming for them. Chapter 10. The Dawn of Renewal. The storm raged through the night with an unrelenting fury. The wind tore through the trees, bending them low as though the earth itself were in torment. The rain fell in torrents, a relentless barrage of water that seemed to come from every direction, flooding the fields and turning the once thriving earth into a churn of mud and chaos. Inside the barn, Emma and John huddled together, their hearts racing in their chests, their minds filled with dread from the unsettling encounter with the mysterious figure. The figure, something ancient, something dangerous, was a warning. It was clear now. They were not just fighting a storm. They were battling forces that had been awakened by something deeper than they could ever understand. John, ever practical, had no time for fear. As the winds howled outside, he worked tirelessly to calm the animals, his hands moving with precision even in the face of the unknown. He spoke to them softly, his voice steady, as though reassuring not just the animals, but himself as well. The cows were unsettled, the pigs restless, and the chickens huddled together for comfort. He worked until his muscles ached, but he never stopped, never wavered in his resolve. Emma stayed by his side, her hands trembling as she assisted, making sure that the barn was secure and that no creature was left in distress. But in her heart, a deep, gnawing fear lingered. The figure that had appeared at the barn had left its mark on her soul. It was more than just its eerie appearance. It was its words, cold and filled with a certainty that threatened to tear apart everything they had known. The earth belonged to the earth, and the earth would have its due. They had no place here. But John didn't speak of giving up. Neither did Emma. They had no choice but to fight, to survive, to protect their home. They had faced hardship before. This was no different, they told themselves. But as the hours wore on, with the storm showing no sign of abating, Emma couldn't shake the nagging thought that something greater was at play. The storm, the land's strange illness, the hawk, everything was connected. And whatever was coming, they were not yet prepared for it. As dawn approached, the storm showed signs of subsiding. The wind slowed its furious pace, the rain became lighter, and the sky, once an oppressive, dark mass of clouds, began to lighten ever so slightly. But the air still felt thick, charged with energy that Emma couldn't explain. The tension in the barn was palpable. Emma and John, exhausted and on edge, tried to rest as best they could, but sleep never truly came. Their minds were alive with questions, with worries of what was still to come. And then, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the breaking storm clouds, something shifted. At first, it was subtle. A soft hum in the air, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of Emma's neck stand on end. She glanced at John, who was still tending to the cows, his brow furrowed in concentration. She felt it too, this strange pull, as if something invisible was drawing them to the outside world. "John," Emma called softly, her voice low and tinged with uncertainty. "Do you feel that?" John paused for a moment, his gaze lifting from the cows to meet her eyes. A flicker of recognition passed across his face. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice grave. "I feel it too." They stood there in silence for a moment, the sound of the storm now distant, but the weight of the unknown still heavy in the air. And then, without another word, they both turned toward the barn doors. The animals, sensing something had changed, were calmer now, their restless movements subsiding. They walked together toward the doors, hand in hand. As they stepped out into the clearing, Emma felt a strange sense of both dread and hope. The land before them, though still damp and muddied from the storm, seemed to breathe with new life. The trees swayed gently, as though whispering something ancient. The air was cooler, fresher, and the first hints of daylight cut through the storm clouds, bathing the earth in soft golden light. But it wasn't just the sky that seemed to have changed. The cornfield, which had been so withered and sickly just days before, was now alive. The stalks, though still fragile, had begun to grow, green shoots pushing through the soil as if reborn. The earth beneath their feet, once heavy with despair, now hummed with vitality, as though it had been cleansed of its affliction. John and Emma stood still for a long moment, their eyes wide in disbelief. The earth had responded. The storm had passed, but something else had occurred during the night, something beyond their understanding. Suddenly, Emma felt a lightness in her chest, a warmth that spread from her heart outward, filling every fiber of her being. She breathed in deeply, her eyes scanning the land, feeling the change, feeling the pulse of life beneath her feet. And for the first time in days, she smiled. "We did it," she whispered. John nodded, his face softening. His voice, though tired, was filled with quiet relief. "The land's come back to us." The animals, sensing the change, began to stir. The cows lowed softly, the pigs grunted in contentment, and the chickens clucked in the distance. The farm, their home, was whole again. It was as if the storm had purged the land of its sickness, leaving only hope in its wake. But Emma knew there was something deeper at play. The storm, the figure, the strange pull of the earth, it was all connected. They had been tested, and they had survived. But the true strength of the land, of life itself, had yet to fully reveal itself. Emma felt a deep knowing in her bones that this was only the beginning. They had been given a second chance, not just by the earth, but by something older, something more powerful. They had passed through the storm, and now they stood on the other side, ready to rebuild, ready to protect their home. Together, they would nurture the land, care for the animals, and face whatever challenges came next. For no matter what the future held, they would face it as they always had, with unwavering love, strength, and faith in the world they had built. As the morning sun rose higher, casting a golden glow over the fields, Emma and John stood side by side, watching the land stir to life once more. The storm was over, but the journey, this new chapter, was just beginning. And with that, they turned toward the future, ready to embrace whatever came next. The earth had reclaimed its power, and they were part of its story. Together,